Hey everybody, so here's the homework and we'll just go through it problem by problem. So on the first page here, we're looking at how does it change going from the first function to the second function. And so in terms of the opening direction, it's going from a positive to a negative, therefore it's got reflected downwards. If I'm looking at the kind of like the slope of the parabola, it's going from a 1 to a 2, so therefore it got steeper. And then when we look at the vertices there, it's going from a -3 to a -1, so that means it went 2 to the right. And then going from a 7 down to a -2, that means it went 9 units down. For the second problem here, it went from a positive coefficient to a positive coefficient, so there was no reflection. It went from a 1 to a 1, so again there's no change in the steepness. And then in terms of the vertex, it went from a -4 to a -2, so that means it went 2 units to the right. And then it went from a -2 to a +2 for the y value, so that means the parabola moved up 4 units. For the third problem here, again, if you take a look, you have a positive coefficient to start with and a positive coefficient to end with, so that means there was no reflection. The graph just stayed facing upwards. And then it went from a 1/2 down to a 1/4, so that means the graph got flatter. And then in terms of the vertex, it went from a 5 to the left over to -1, so that means it went 6 units to the left. And then went from a +2 to a -3, so that means the vertex moved down 5 units. And on the last problem here, we see that it goes from a negative to a positive, therefore the graph got reflected upwards. And then it went from a 2 to a 3, so therefore the graph got steeper. And then in terms of the vertex, it went from +1 over to -4, so that's 5 units to the left. And then in terms of the y value, it went from 6 to 6 and it stayed there, so that means there was no vertical translation. Let's take a look at the back side. Alright, so we have a vertex in the second quadrant. That means we're going to have a negative x value and a positive y value. So if I take a look here, that means I should have a plus something, whatever number you want. And then over here you should have another plus something. Since it opens down, our a value is going to be negative, and since it's flatter than normal, that means we should have some fraction between 0 and 1, like for example 1/4. Moving on to number 2. We have a vertex in the third quadrant, which means you should have a negative x value and a negative y value for your vertex. So that's going to give you a plus something here for your h and then a minus something here for the k. It opens up, therefore your a is positive, and since it has a normal shape, that means your vertex should be 1. For number 3, you have a vertex in the fourth quadrant, so that means you should get a positive x value and a negative y. So that's going to give you x minus something here and then minus something outside the parentheses. And since it opens up, you should have a positive coefficient, and since it's flatter than normal, again, you should have some coefficient that's between 0 and 1, like 2/3. And then for number 4, you're going to have a vertex in the first quadrant, so that's going to give you a positive x value and a positive y value. So that's going to give you x minus something here and then plus something here for your k. And then, since it opens down, you should have a negative coefficient, and since it's steeper than normal, you should have a coefficient that's greater than 1, like for example 3. And again, all the stuff here on the back, remember, this is the level 4 questions. Alright, so for number 5, we start with this equation, and then it doesn't get reflected, so that coefficient of 2 there is going to stay a positive coefficient of 2. And the vertex here gets translated 5 units right and 2 units down. So that means it's going to go over to 9 and then down to -7. Alright, check out number 6. So here, it does get reflected. So therefore that -3 is going to become a +3. It's now opening upwards. And the vertex that used to be -3, -2 is going to get moved 6 units to the right. So now it's going to be over at a +3. And then 4 units up, so from -2 up to a +2. And there's going to be your new equation. For number 7, we have a negative coefficient here, so that means it's opening down, but then it gets reflected, so that means we should have a positive coefficient here, so it's opening up. The vertex used to be 2, 3, but it got moved 3 units to the left, so that ends up at a -1 for your x value, and then 6 units up, so we add 6 to 3, and we get a positive 9, and therefore that should be your new function, your new equation there. And then for number 8, so this one's a little tricky, because if you take a look at the vertex here, your h value is -5, but then you don't see anything out here, so that just means that your k value, right, would be like +0, right? So the y part of the vertex is going to be 0. So it was a -1/2 for your coefficient, and it was opening down. So since it's not reflected, it's going to stay that way. And then when you move your vertex, you move it 5 units to the right. Well, if you add 5 to -5, you get 0. And if you notice, that looks kind of weird down here also, right? So again, what happened was that, I mean, you could have written it like this. You have an h value of 0. But really, x minus 0 is just x, so you just get x squared here. And then when you move 4 units down from 0 here, you end up at a -4. And so that's why you have this -4 here for your k value. And that is it.